We know about the Sacklers' history and their neglect, but how bad are they exactly? More documents show that this family is even worse than you may have imagined, and yet they've almost entirely gotten away with their despicable acts. Fair warning, there is no happy ending and justice to this episode, as is the case with all the victims of the Sackler family. So welcome back to the Part 2 episode all about the Sackler family here on The Corporate Casket. In the first episode, we discussed how Purdue was founded and some of their early litigation. Now it's finally time to address where that leaves them in the modern day. Please know that this episode will, of course, heavily discuss addiction and mention suicide, so please be warned of that before you continue. It wasn't until 2016 that the CDC announced that many Americans have been overprescribed OxyContin, and new guidelines for prescribers were released. The CDC recommended that opioids should not be the first line or only treatment for patients who present with chronic non-cancer pain as an issue of safety. At this point, the Sackler name wasn't exactly looking too great. They've been investigated, ordered to pay $600 million in criminal and civil penalties, and pled guilty to misbranding, a word that makes the crimes they perpetuated on the American people sound like nothing more than a simple mistake. So what were they to do? Well, the Sacklers decided that the best way they could help the people who were addicted to Oxy was by selling naloxone, an overdose-reversing drug. Purdue created the opioid crisis, then manufactured a cure, profiting off people's dependency from both ends. The Associated Press wrote this a few years ago. The gleaming white booth towered over the medical conference in Italy in October, advertising a new brand of antidote for opioid overdoses. Be prepared, get naloxone, save a life, the slogan on its walls said. Purdue's plan, codenamed Project Tango, discussed how the sale of opioids and treatment of addiction are naturally linked, and that began in 2014. Dr. Kathy Sackler, daughter of Mortimer, was involved in the project, as were other Purdue executives. Records show that Richard Sackler blamed Oxy abuse on reckless criminals, and yet the moment that Purdue wanted to treat these people, they became far more sympathetic. One of his emails read, "This can happen to anyone, from a 50-year-old woman with chronic back pain to an 18-year-old boy with a sports injury, from the very wealthy to the very poor." Initially, Purdue also was going to sell Suboxone, a film that melts in the mouth, according to ProPublica. When Kathy Sackler asked staff members to look into reports that children might be swallowing the film, they reassured her. They responded, according to the complaint, that youngsters were overdosing on pills but not the films, which is a positive for Tango. Purdue sat on information about Oxy being addictive for years, ignoring employees who told them doctors were abusing or illegally prescribing Oxy, and then attempted to dominate the treatment market as well. By 2019, the Sackler name was pretty universally hated. Details of Project Tango came to light, and multiple states, as well as 500 counties, cities, and Native American tribes named the Sacklers in a lawsuit. Eventually, the number of cases against them hit about 2,000 party members. Their efforts to dismiss trials were shot down, and as the New York Times illustrated, the stakes got higher as more data was turned in, roughly 67 million documents. Knowing whether or not to hold drugstores liable became tricky as well. In one example, the article illustrated, a knee surgery patient goes home with opioids. His teenage son finds the pills in the bathroom medicine cabinet and starts down a jagged road that ends in heroin addiction. Should the companies that made, distributed, and sold the prescription painkillers be liable? What if the son sold them to a friend who turned to street drugs and overdosed? Are the drug companies responsible then? Multiply these examples by many years and generations of analogous scenarios. Now tabulate the accumulating drain on civic budgets for emergency responders, hospitals, incarceration, drug courts, rehab, mental health services, child welfare. Whether the companies should have foreseen the growth of an illicit second market including pills, heroin, and fentanyl is among the knotty questions being addressed. The Sacklers themselves continually denied any wrongdoing and said that the lawsuits ignored how the Sacklers were committed to initiatives that prevent abuse. It's true, the Sacklers have been committed to treatments, but only when those treatments line their own pockets. The thing is, I've continually stated over the years that the quality of evidence matters. After all, we've seen hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands, of claims about how supplements and MLMs work, all with no real data to back that up. When it comes to Purdue and the Sackler family, I can't say with complete and total certainty that false advertising, negligence, or a hastily written prescription played a role. However, the fact that there are this many cases and Purdue actively ignored the dangers of their products, well, it certainly doesn't lend credence to the Sackler's side of things. Richard, Raymond's son, was also said to have argued with Purdue's vice president for sales, saying that a warning about opioids wasn't needed because it would simply imply a danger that wasn't there. The rest of the Sackler family has disputed this and said that Richard was only upset about where the warning label should appear on the bottle. But the evidence against them has been incredibly damning. For instance, Raymond, now deceased, had sent 3 other Sacklers a confidential memo about Purdue's strategy for placing patients on high doses of opioids for extended periods of time. In the memo, Raymond noted that doctors argued against the practice, but Richard didn't care. Not long after that, Jonathan Sackler, another one of Raymond's sons and a board member, pushed to develop a brand new opioid. Given their emails and their influence on the board, I'd agree that this was as much the Sackler company as it was Purdue. News outlets and thousands of lawsuits have said very similar things. They didn't just name Purdue as the problem, but also those running it. David Sackler, Richard's son and Raymond's grandson, represented the family in court as the de facto family spokesperson. There, they stuck with the mindset that the company sees little good coming from years of wasteful litigation, but agreed to sell Mundy Pharma, a global pharmaceutical company they own, to pay their settlements. Just to give you an example of what various states and entities were saying about Purdue and the Sacklers at the time, I've got a lawsuit against them from the state of Connecticut, and I'll read a bit of it now, and here's how it goes. Among other things, the defendants, Purdue's materials and publications admonish doctors that under-treatment of pain is a serious problem and that pain should be treated aggressively with opioids. The defendants did not disclose that the claim lacked any scientific evidence. To convince doctors to increase the dose for addicted patients, the defendants peddled the false notion that patients suffered from pseudo-addiction. The defendants falsely claimed that physical dependence on its opioids was a normal physiologic response and an expected occurrence, no more dangerous than responses to many classes of medications that are not addictive, including drugs used to treat high blood pressure. From 2013 to 2016, Connecticut experienced more than 4-fold increase in mortality from prescription opioid overdose, from 5.7 deaths to 24.5 deaths per 100,000 persons. Connecticut consumers, individuals, employers, and private insurers have paid millions for opioid prescriptions. Healthcare costs for persons addicted to opioids are much higher than healthcare costs for the general population. In 2014, opioid addicts' annual private healthcare costs exceeded non-addicts' private healthcare costs by over $14,000. The annual cost of treating opioid addiction and overdose has increased by more than 8-fold since 2004, from $0.3 billion to $2.6 billion in 2016. The lawsuit also stated which Sacklers were on the board of directors and how they'd held these positions throughout the entirety of the opioid epidemic. The directors and CEO were warned on numerous occasions about their deceptive practices and required to undergo hours of training to ensure they understood this. Yet the Sacklers didn't listen. When they hired a new director, they didn't train them and lied about doing so. They kept appointing new salespeople. As the lawsuit states plainly in black and white, the Sacklers had the authority to stop deadly misconduct, and they didn't. And that's the main disturbing point in all of this. They knew that they were killing people for the sake of profit, and they just didn't care. The complete and utter lack of empathy disturbed quite a few people looking into this case. The emails, Project Tango, all of it really, it feels like something out of a movie. There doesn't seem to be any other side to this, no misunderstanding and no gray area. The Sacklers have shown no regard for human life, and frankly, it's hard for me to wrap my head around it. When all these lawsuits were being filed, David Sackler asked how long the family would stay rich for and suggested the family lever up, removing cash from Purdue so they could have it for future lawsuits. Between 2008 to 2017, the family removed $10 billion from Purdue, spent millions lobbying members of Congress, and as the lawsuits piled up in 2019, had Purdue file for bankruptcy. Though the Sacklers were aware that they looked pretty appalling to the public, their solution and attempt to remedy this, as well as their interactions with the public, were just straight up bizarre. Joss Sackler, David's wife, spoke out in Town and Country magazine, making some incredibly odd and infuriating statements. She created a fashion line known as LBV, which she called a women's initiative unrelated to Purdue. When people criticized her for it, saying it was a hideous fashion line made possible by blood money, Joss continued to preach that it was about promoting women's empowerment. While normally I'll say, hey, you can do whatever you want with your own money. In this case, I believe that no Sackler deserves to live an easy, cushy lifestyle when they can start their own clothing lines for funsies as long as there are people who suffered and died from their misinformation. In reference to a Times article criticizing her for this very fashion line, she states, I knew something was up because the paper would not refer to me as Dr. Joss Sackler, she says at one point. I told them I have a PhD in linguistics. She later adds, they're going to regret fucking with a linguist. They already do. And as a side note, I don't know how many times I had to re-record this quote because all I want to say is that, I told them I have a PhD in linguini. I know this is serious and I don't know why, but all I can think of, she had a PhD in linguini and I hate myself. While the Times article about Joss and her fashion line definitely isn't flattering, it's truthful. I don't think it's meant to fuck with her, as she so eloquently put it, or to be hateful. Instead, the article points out the fact that the Sackler family profited off an opioid epidemic and now they're finding themselves in a massive scandal. They've made many generous donations to schools, research centers, libraries, courtyards, and things of that nature, but giving away a tiny portion of their billions earned through questionable means, it feels hollow, and it's certainly not an apology. At times, they've even pointed the fingers at others, moving in the opposite direction of taking accountability. David, for example, recently created a new website called judgeforyourselves.info that is meant to reveal false narratives about the Sackler family. So naturally, I went to the website to see if the Sacklers made any decent or genuine points, but instead, I just found loads and loads of misinformation. Right on the front page, they have a header that reads, "How did the opioid epidemic overtake America?" The prevailing narrative offered a too easy scapegoat. If not Purdue, who drove the epidemic? Out of context, this quote, which they claim is from the Washington Post, makes it sound as if the article agreed that Purdue is only a scapegoat. In actuality, here's the full quotation from that Washington Post article. It is one of the biggest stories of our time, and it was hiding in plain sight. How did the opioid epidemic overtake America? The prevailing narrative offered a too easy scapegoat. Purdue Pharma in the 1990s unleashed an ostensible wonder drug, OxyContin, and addicted millions. But the epidemic took off after Purdue was brought to heel and fined $600 million. If not Purdue, who drove the epidemic, and why didn't anyone stop them? The Washington Post definitively answered these questions in 2019, establishing an accurate narrative that brought accountability to the companies involved and the government officials who failed to act. And I've seen some hilariously ridiculous examples of misquoting, but this one's gotta be one of the worst. After all, not only were they twisting the Washington Post words, but they twisted them so far that it appeared as if this news source might be on their side when nothing could be further from the truth. It's true, the Washington Post didn't just blame Purdue. They also questioned the doctors and pharmacies that drove this epidemic. Even though I feel Purdue is massively responsible for the marketing practices and for rewarding doctors for writing prescriptions, I'll acknowledge that the doctors that wrote them should be held accountable for their recklessness too. But for the Sacklers to act as if the Washington Post is on their side when they and plenty of other news sources have called them out on their despicable behavior, that's laughable. It's like if the Sacklers watched this entire series and then quoted one sentence from episode 1 where I said the FDA shouldn't have approved their product information. And yes, the FDA and plenty of other organizations made mistakes along the way that contributed to this crisis, but that doesn't make the Sacklers any less guilty. Still, for the sake of getting both sides here, I considered one of the specific examples they gave about false claims made against them. In a New Yorker article by Keefe, one that I used as a source material fairly frequently in the first episode, Keefe wrote that the Sacklers dynasty ruthless marketing of painkillers has generated billions of dollars and millions of addicts. They say he was lying. The Sacklers themselves say that oxy prescriptions have never amounted to more than 4% of the market for prescription opioids. Here's why I personally believe Keefe's statement is still accurate as supported by CDC data and discussed elsewhere in the series. This isn't just OxyContin and Purdue's specific brand that led to this opioid epidemic. It is the fact that their specific marketing and their specific promotion of painkillers helped foster an environment where opioids could thrive. Many other painkiller producers followed in their footsteps, that much is true, and those companies deserve to face justice as well. But Keefe's statement here was to explain that Purdue's marketing was devastatingly problematic and that much is supported by data and lawsuits that we've seen. Another quote written by Keefe that Purdue claims is demonstrably false is as follows. Purdue, facing a shrinking market and rising opprobrium, has not given up the search for new users. In August 2015, over objections from critics, the company received FDA approval to market OxyContin to children as young as 11. The Sacklers argue Purdue never sought or obtained permission to market OxyContin to children. Even if the FDA wasn't involved with the marketing, there's no denying that they approved the drug for kids as young as 11 who need pain relief. The FDA stated that this wasn't to expand the use of opioids in children, but the Sacklers benefited from exactly this. Among the many allegations against them, Purdue paid off executives who were convicted of fraudulently marketing OxyContin to ensure their loyalty. They were also advised by global consulting firm McKinsey & Co. on how to counter the emotional messages of mothers whose children overdosed. The Sackler family received more than $4 billion in payouts from Purdue from 2007 to 2019, so of course, why would they stop raking in the cash? The payments were the motivation for the Sacklers' misconduct, the 2019 Massachusetts complaint says, and the payments were deliberate decisions to benefit from deception in Massachusetts at great cost to patients and families. On their website, the Sacklers have continued to insist that because the FDA has approved their 12-hour dosing label, they're in the right and everyone else who doubts the efficacy of taking Oxy this way is wrong. They've insisted the emails that have been uncovered really meant something else or were taken out of context, although the facts remain the same. They've taken no accountability whatsoever and have instead appeared like a caricature of the most out-of-touch, emotionalist, inhumane billionaires I may have ever covered. Just for a bit of a joke, John Oliver actually bought this domain from them, judge for yourselves, but he purchased it with a .com at the end instead to drive more visitors. His website, hilariously enough, has far more accurate information about the Sacklers on it and allows you to read Richard Sackler's full deposition. The letters filed with the bankruptcy court and transcripts of phone calls to the bankruptcy court from those impacted by the opioid crisis. A third, especially pathetic incident occurred when ProPublica managed to get their hands on the 8-hour-long deposition of Richard Sackler in which he said, "I don't know," more than 100 times. Some of the questions he answered "I don't know" to were quite simple ones too, such as,
how much money has Purdue Frederick or Purdue Pharma made off the sale of OxyContin?
I don't know.
Okay. Do you know how much the Sackler family has made off the sale of OxyContin?
I don't know.
Whether or not Richard actually does know the answer to the question, I can't say. But you'd think the former president of Purdue might have some sort of understanding about their profits, right? Well, before we continue on to talk about what is the conclusion and Purdue filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy and all that good stuff, let's just take a quick moment to thank today's sponsors. It is time to talk about the sponsor that made me publicly say dolphin legs multiple times, and now that you guys know how I describe smooth legs, many of you can't unhear it, and so here we are. Thank you, Athena Club. Once upon a time, I shaved my legs, stepped out of the shower looking like I was on the losing end of a battle with a tiny animal. So many cuts and so much blood. Because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ever shave around my knees or ankles without some bloodletting. But again, no longer, thanks to Athena Club. Athena Club's razor has built-in skin guards that are gentle on curves and help prevent razor burn. Their razor blade handle is surrounded by a water-activated serum with shea butter and hyaluronic acid, and their razor kit is only $9, plus 2 razor heads, a magnetic hook for the shower, and a choice of color. And I don't think I can name all the colors right off the top of my head, but I know there's black, white, there's peach, there's blues, there was purple, and I'm still very upset that I missed out on that limited edition color, but they have a ton of colors, and they come out with limited edition ones from time to time too, which is just turning me into like an addict of searching their website. But anyway, if you also want to acquire dolphin legs this season, make sure you show your skin you care with the Athena Club Razor Kit. Sign up today and you'll get 20% off your first order. Just go to athenaclub.com and use promo code Casket. That's athenaclub.com with promo code Casket for 20% off. This episode of the Corporate Casket is also sponsored by Talkspace. Working on our mental health is never a bad idea, and Talkspace makes it easy with a licensed therapist right from your device, and get the guidance or help you might need. I know in the past couple months, I've most certainly been stumbling downward into a little depressive spiral all over again. I don't know why it happens in the winter time, but it does, and I really like that Talkspace is there so that I can just curl up in my blankets at home on my bed and talk to someone and not even have to leave the house anymore. Talkspace makes your privacy and security their number one priority. Their encryption keeps all your conversations fully protected, and you can message your therapist throughout the day and get timely feedback from a professional. It doesn't matter what you're going through. Maybe it's some depression like me, or anxiety, self-doubt, or anything else. Talkspace can give you access to help you so you can move forward. Join Talkspace today and start moving forward with a single message. Just visit Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month when you use promo code CASKET at signup. That's $100 off at Talkspace.com, promo code CASKET. Given all this evidence and litigation, it sure sounds as if the Sacklers are finally in a situation they can't buy themselves out of. Well, sort of is the actual answer. Right now, the plan is for Purdue to become a public benefit trust after declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Then, for the next decade, the Sacklers themselves will pay $4.5 billion. Their current fortune is at least $11 billion as of current estimates. On the whole, this sounds kind of like justice, but only kind of. Purdue Pharma pled guilty to fraud and kickback conspiracies, which finally proves that yes, without a doubt, opioid profits were prioritized over human life. The U.S. Department of Justice wrote in late 2020, Purdue pleaded guilty to an information charge charging it with 3 felony offenses, 1 count of dual object conspiracy to defraud the United States and to violate the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and 2 counts of conspiracy to violate the federal anti-kickback statute. The abuse and diversion of prescription opioids has contributed to a national tragedy of addiction and deaths, in addition to those caused by illicit street opioids, the Deputy Attorney General Jeffrey A. Rosen. Today's guilty pleas to 3 felony charges send a strong message to the pharmaceutical industry that illegal behavior will have serious consequences. Further, today's convictions underscore the department's commitment to its multi-pronged strategy for defeating the opioid crisis. The trouble, however, is the fact that the Sacklers themselves have been charged with absolutely nothing. When Kathy Sackler testified remotely in court last year, not only was she quick to remind people that the Sacklers weren't coming under fire, it was Purdue that was on trial, but she refused to apologize. When asked if she would apologize to the American people for the role she played in the opioid crisis, her exact words were this:
I have tried to figure out, is there anything that I could have done differently, knowing what I knew then, not what I know now? And I have to say, there's nothing that I can find that I would have done differently.
It's one hell of an apology. It's hardly any wonder why articles called them an evil family and their reputation is in the toilet where it belongs. David Sackler, when asked the same question, said he was sorry OxyContin played a role in addiction and death, but believed that he conducted himself ethically. And for note, this is the same man who asked, "How long will we stay rich for?" and was concerned about protecting the family's wealth when the lawsuits started rolling in. The Sacklers were able to get off the hook for these opioid suits because they refused to settle unless their own butts were covered with a third-party release. This deal has been granted by just a few bankruptcy courts, but luckily for the Sacklers, the court in White Plains had a bankruptcy judge named Robert Drain who has a history of approving deals such as these. An especially disheartening blow for everyone that wanted to see justice done is the fact that this immunity and these protections mean that the Sacklers themselves can't be tried in court, even for cases that have already been filed. And the immunity not only covers the Sacklers, but over 160 trusts, at least 170 companies, and consultants and other entities associated with them. The Sacklers have become untouchable, leaving everyone who wanted them to face justice without recourse. Those who support the decision say it spares billions of dollars on legal fees and years of lengthy litigation, but frankly, I think the Sacklers deserve to spend the rest of their life in court. If they can't spend that time in jail, this is kind of the next best thing, right? Even though Purdue and the Sacklers may be separate entities, the Sacklers still ran it. They still made these dangerous criminal decisions that Purdue itself has pled guilty to. Critics, including more than 20 state attorney generals, say that the Sacklers are improperly piggybacking on their company's bankruptcy without actually filing bankruptcy themselves. The bankruptcy system should not be allowed to shield non-bankrupt billionaires, said Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey in an interview with NPR last month. Some legal scholars have also questioned whether bankruptcy court is the proper venue for a case that involves an addiction crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. The most socially important Chapter 11 case in history will be determined through a process that does not comport with basic notions of due process, wrote Adam Levitin, who teaches law at Georgetown University, in an article published last month in the Texas Law Review. The Sacklers may have denied wrongdoing, but civil lawsuits allege some family members had direct knowledge of Oxy's addictive qualities. After all, Kathy herself has proudly called herself the taproot of OxyContin, and we know that Purdue has been referred to as the Sackler Company. It doesn't seem right that in 2007, executives were held accountable for their actions to a minor extent, but here the Sacklers walk away scot-free. We'll know more in the coming years, as part of this settlement means that a public repository featuring more than 30 million documents like emails and agreements from Purdue will be released. Yet, even when this does come to light, there's nothing we can do about the documents. It's unlikely we'll ever see justice against the Sackler family. So, the last question here, I guess, is what about the $4.5 billion they have to pay? Isn't that at least some consequence? Well, unfortunately, that's not really a consequence either. If you'll recall, the Sacklers have almost a decade to pay that money off, so about $500 million per year. And while that sounds like an insane amount of money for us, for the Sacklers, it's possible to live relatively well and keep that money flowing. With the gigantic money stack they're sitting on, it's possible that they can live a relatively conservative life, make wise investments, and they'll make money off of their money and be even richer by the time they're finished paying off this money in 2030. With a high return rate, they won't even need to touch their principal. Frankly, I think John Oliver puts it best when he explains the trouble about this. He says, "If you're thinking, well, the Sacklers are paying too much already, what more do you want? I'm sure that's the right way to think about this. Because I would argue that when your family's company recklessly sold a product as damaging as OxyContin, the question might not be how many billions is right for you to pay, but how many billions is it right for you to keep? And I would argue no billions." After spending so much of this series talking about the Sacklers, I want to spend this last portion discussing the victims. According to NPR, as many as 138,000 individuals who filed claims for a death, expenses tied to their addiction, or the birth of a child exposed to opioids during their pregnancy will receive little, if anything. A chart was released that breaks down how many points are given to each tier of addiction. For example, Tier 3 states no addiction/death from Purdue opioids and Purdue opioid use less than 6 months, and has a base payment of $3,500. The second tier is Purdue opioid use for more than 6 months. Tier 1B is death from OxyContin, and Tier 1A is addiction from Purdue opioids. Each tier has 6,000, 40,000, and 20,000 points respectively, with different levels in each of those tiers. And each of those points are going to be worth between 80 cents to $1.20. The chart, according to Lynn Wenkes, who lost her son from an opioid overdose, is a spit in the face. NPR writes, "The maximum award for Jeff Wenkes' death could be between $26,000 and $40,000. It would be 20% higher or lower depending on the final settlement resolution." None of the amounts touch the more than $125,000 the Wenkes family spent on Jeff's care, and they'll only get what's left after attorney and administrative fees as well as outstanding medical claims are paid, so possibly nothing. Yet, even though this deal is an insult, Wenkes voted to approve it, as did many others who were negatively affected by Purdue, like Ryan Hampton, who is in recovery from an addiction to opioids. According to him, without it, victims would have received nothing. "I felt like we were being held hostage," he says. In a way, these victims were held hostage. Bankruptcy court isn't the place for their stories to be heard, but since the Sacklers weren't going to criminal court, how else were they supposed to plead their case? It's really unfortunate that they weren't given any closure after all they suffered, whereas the Sacklers were allowed to espouse their innocence to anyone who would listen. Thankfully, because of the links on judgeforyourselves.com, I was able to find a few letters sent to Judge Robert Drain in this past year. Since I don't believe these families have been heard enough, I'll close out this episode by reading a letter that honestly broke my heart. And this one's from a woman named Stephanie Lubinsky. please be warned that this will contain mentions of suicide and a personal story about addiction. So here it goes. Dear Judge Drain, I am just a small fish in this huge ocean of devastation the Sackler family has caused with their greed. They increased their opulent wealth beyond anything that a blue-collar worker like myself would ever imagine. Yet my family paid the ultimate price for them to get that wealth. My husband, Tori A. Lubinsky, was a healthy, strong, athletic Minneapolis firefighter. We met when we were teenagers, then married for 32 years. He started being prescribed pain medication for a back injury he incurred. He could maintain it and control it for many years, but then he was prescribed OxyContin. That was the beginning of the end for Troy. For the past 15 to 20 years, our life was a roller coaster. He was no longer the man that we all knew and loved. The OxyContin totally took control of his life, his senses, his mental health, and his physical health. He could no longer care about anything but getting more OxyContin. He could no longer be a firefighter. He had 2 heart attacks from the anxiety and stress this addiction created. We lost our home and personal items that were sold to get more OxyContin. He did go into treatment at Hazelden Betty Ford and seemed to be getting better. That only lasted 3 months. All he had to do was go back to the doctor and was back on OxyContin. He started losing his mind, paranoia, anxiety, thought he was being followed by the FBI. He thought I was having affairs all across the country. It was complete insanity. We could no longer help him. He left and moved to a small town in Minnesota all alone with his 2 dogs. He was gone for 5 years. On December 8, 2017, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and was given 3 to 5 years to live. I had major surgery in January 2018 and was nervous about my care and finances. I retired from my job of 32 years to enjoy the time I had left, and I did file for divorce on November 5, 2019 to protect my children. I don't expect the world in our claim, and nothing will replace our beloved Troy. But my children deserve some compensation, while the Sacklers have not suffered at all. This past year, we thought he was getting better and he was realizing the losses he had created. He was mending relationships and sounding sensible. But it was not to be. He committed suicide on September 22, 2020, leaving our family devastated. He no longer wanted to live with his addiction and pain of what he had destroyed any longer. I may only have another year or 2 to live, and only want for my children to have some satisfaction in knowing the Sackler family will suffer a morsel of what we have. And I believe the Sackler family should know what their greed has caused. They should know the name Troy Lubinsky and the many, many others that have lost their lives to OxyContin. The families that lived the life of loving an addict and are now left to grieve and this horrible void because of their selfishness. Judge Drain, I have enclosed some pictures and words my children have written about their father, Troy Lubinsky. He meant the world to us, and he needs to be remembered and apologized to by the Sackler family. I have filed a claim and amended claim to include his suicide on September 22, 2020. There is clear and convincing evidence of Purdue Pharma's gross negligence and reckless indifference to Troy's health, well-being, and suffering. Thank you so much for giving consideration to our claim, Stephanie Lubinsky. Thank you for giving some of your time to listen to today's episode and to listen to part 2 about the opioid epidemic, Purdue, and the Sackler family. Stephanie Lubinsky, her family, Troy, this is not an uncommon situation. Many families suffered immeasurable grief and pain and suffering at this family and this company's hands, and their stories need to be known.